This is Austin Liti Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. In this episode, Scott talks with author James Wade about his latest novel, Beasts of the Earth.
Welcome to the show, James Wade. How you doing, James?
I'm doing well, my friend. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing fantastic. That hot summer is over. Thank God. Man, my yard looks like sawdust right now.
Yeah, ours is about the same, man. It's good though, because once it dies, you don't have to mow it.
That's true. That's true. So I read your new book, which comes out in October, Beasts of the Earth. Excellent novel. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book, kind of give us your quick pitch to the viewers about what the book's about?
Sure. Yeah. Beast of the Earth follows Harlan LeBlanc, who is a quiet, minds his own business groundskeeper at a high school in Central Texas in the 1980s. And when a crime happens on campus and a student is murdered, one of LeBlanc's friends is pinned for the murder. And in trying to help clear his friend's name, he kind of puts himself in the sights of law enforcement, and also conjures up some demons from the past that he's worked really hard to keep at bay. And now the floodgates are kind of starting to open. And so the novel is kind of him trying to deal with that and grapple with his own morality, his own sense of justice, and what he's going to ultimately decide to do.
So one of the things I immediately noticed with this novel is that, in comparison to your first two are really grounded in nature, right? You have a lot of discussion about not only the scene, what's going on, wilderness in nature, but nature's kind of like a force to be reckoned with. And that's not really part of this particular narrative. It seems to be more grounded in the town and the townsfolk. It opens up with LeBlanc walking around town and people are looking at him and stuff. Can you talk about that shift a little bit? What was that like when you started this book? I'm sure it must have been quite different for you to ground
Absolutely.
it differently.
Yeah, it's not that the first two books were necessarily like happy reads or anything, but with this book, the themes that I started with were a little darker. And because of the title, Beast of the Earth, I mean, that alludes to nature and to animals and creatures and all this stuff. But the juxtaposition is obviously that we men are the true beasts of the earth. And so nature is kind of boxed out of this novel a lot. And there is so much of it revolves around industry. So we see in the 1980s in the oil glut in Texas, we see all these out of work folks, and we see the town that had kind of grown up in the oil boom is now kind of decaying and falling on hard times, all kind of at the mercy of industry and at the mercy of things that don't have a lot to do with nature. And so, and then in some of the scenes where LeBlanc goes down to Beaumont and he sees what is essentially just all of these oil refineries and smog and all this stuff, and how that plays out against the ocean and kind of overshadows it. And so it was a conscious decision to box nature out a little bit, just to kind of shed even more light on the things that the men in the novel are doing.
Right. There's also a shift from kind of like suspenseful storytelling to more of a murder mystery. Was that a conscious decision to kind of shift it that way, where LeBlanc finds his friend with the dead girl near the football field, and then of course that's kind of like the pall that kind of hangs over the story towards the end? Was that a conscious shift for you with this book?
Yeah, so each book that I've written, I've kind of toyed with a little different aspect of genre. So if literary fiction is kind of the overarching theme or umbrella, the first one was a Western, the second one was a little more of a thriller, kind of, what you alluded to. And then, yeah, this one was, it didn't set out to be a mystery, but I thought as I was kind of working my way through the first draft that would just add a little more suspense, a little more conflict for the reader to kind of keep the pages turning a little bit. And yeah, so it's not some big, twisty turny, the plot changes 27 different times, but there is an element of suspense that comes with kind of not knowing who the killer is, and following LeBlanc and kind of in his own investigation of everything. And so yeah, that was conscious as well, and it was something I never tried before. And I just still, as a reader and a writer and a thinker, I like to grow and try new things, and just kind of keep it as fresh as I can for myself, and then hopefully that kind of plays out for readers as well.
Right. So there's also like in the story, there's two very distinct timelines. They happen at different times. And of course, you're wondering through the entire novel how they're going to tie together at the end. So when you were writing this book, how did you track those timelines? Was that something that you did some preparation beforehand, or were you just kind of juggling some balls through writing it to see where for you it would tie together at the end?
Yeah, there was, you know, so the second timeline that you're talking about happens in Louisiana in the 1960s, down in the swamp. And initially, that was a much shorter part of the story. It's still secondary to LeBlanc's story, but I would say that maybe a third of what actually, made it into the book was what I had started with. And what happened is these characters from the 60s just kept kind of nagging at me, and their roles kind of kept growing and growing, and I could see the themes matching up.
Right.
And so essentially, to your question, what I did was just wrote both simultaneously, just bouncing back from one to the other. And when I was done, I put them in two separate Word docs and just kind of looked at where I could space out the alternating chapters and where I could get kind of the two crescendos, because they both start, vaguely enough, and then they just build and build and build, and each kind of has this big moment at the end. And I wanted to have those moments line up at the end of the novel. And so I basically had them lined up and then worked backwards from there in terms of placing everything together like a jigsaw puzzle.
One thing that I was kind of glad to see is there's some humor in this book. Some of the things that characters in the town say are pretty funny. The way they kind of rib each other is pretty funny. Is that also something that you're conscious about, just adding something like that to your writing? Not the first two, I wouldn't necessarily say had very much humor in them. They're very serious tales. But this one actually, I mean, even though it's a dark tale, I really enjoyed kind of like watching a Coen Brothers movie, just the unique personalities kind of talking to each other. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's especially with a darker tale, you really need that humor a little bit, I think, to balance it out. And also, if you're trying to create something that's, rooted in realism, then the reality is, even in somber times, or even, through dark situations and circumstances, we tend, as humans, it's actually pretty spectacular to witness, we tend to keep our humor somewhat. And so in this town, you have all these folks who have, lost a lot of money, they're out of work, it is a depressing time for them, and sometimes all you can turn to is humor. And again, it's also just kind of the realism of folks in a small rural Texas town, so a lot of that comes through. And with the first two novels, there was a little bit of that, just to try to shape the characters and the setting, but there wasn't nearly the conscious effort that there was in this novel to, hey, let's have some, almost like, some one-liners, some back and forth ribbing, and I think that's important. And I think the more that I read and the more that I dig into the authors that I really admire, I see that in their work as well.
Mm.
There are a lot of humor even in the darkest gritlit novels, and so yeah, that was a conscious decision, and I'm very glad that you thought it was funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I caught pretty quickly, and it's something that I have in my own work. I like to talk about some dark themes, but I like to balance it, like you said, with some humor. I feel like it's kind of like subterfuge where you can kind of get a little more of the themes into the reader's brain if you can at least kind of catch them off guard with a little bit of humor. And so I admit that I really enjoyed seeing that in your book. There is a lovely passage, though, that I want to read real quick, and then I want to ask you a question about in chapter 13. If you don't mind, I'm going to read it real quick.
Yes, sir.
Michael moved closer to him, and Remus grabbed the boy and pulled him to his side and hugged him tight. They stood there alongside Chester's grave as the sky turned purple and orange at the edge of the swamp. The scattered matrix of cypress limbs cut across the sunset like torn curtains, and Remus had taught the boy something about the world, and it wasn't that there were bad men. This boy already knew. It was that there were good men too. And so I really love this passage because there was an element of hope. And I think in your previous two books, there was that element there, but it was more subtle. This is very explicit, like the narrator's saying this. And I think getting to know you over the past few years, I know that you have this in you. And it was nice to see you explicitly say it in the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It was important both for me as a writer and also for young Michael, the character, to see that, and to have that, like you said, explicitly stated, because Michael came from such a just terrible situation, and for a reader, just like the balance of humor, you also want to see that your characters have some kind of hope, some kind of at least shot or opportunity at seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, or else it actually takes away from the conflict, right? If it's all dark all the time, then it's kind of like, what is the actual story based on? And so yeah, so when Michael, who, just a quick recap, he's on the run, basically from his just terrible human being of a father, and he gets taken in by this old man who lives out in the swamp, and who's a poet and a former journalist, and a very captivating character in himself, Remus. And in Remus taking care of him and showing him this kindness, it kind of gives Michael a fresh perspective on the world. Not that everything is now all of a sudden happy, but just that there is that balance, right? There are bad men. Michael already knows this, but Remus proves to him that there are good men, which is something that he previously, probably didn't even realize. And so, yeah, so that was important, to have that in there, and it also helps balance the novel a little bit more to have that hope. And also it speaks a little more to kind of the moral conundrum, that we see with LeBlanc in his section of the story, because he knows that the difference between right and wrong. He knows, good versus bad, but he still struggles with it, right? But if you don't know, if you don't have an idea of each side, then there's no struggle there, right?
Right. So let's switch it up a little bit. So I recently went back and reread some classics. Do you go and revisit some classics or some of the books from when you were a young man that inspired you and absorb them again? And if so, what's an example of one recently that you went back and looked at, and what did you learn from it?
Absolutely. Well, I reread All the Pretty Horses pretty much every year,
Hmm.
and I reread McCarthy a lot. I reread Melville, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor. I mean, honestly, I probably shun contemporary fiction a little too much to go back and read the classics, because there are so many great writers that are coming
Yeah.
out now, and I try to read as much as I can, but I usually just end up reading my friends' books, and then the classics, and so. But one that a McCarthy novel that I had not previously reread until this year, was Suttree, which is his fourth novel, and like the one novel in his canon that kind of sticks out as really different. And in part because of what we talked about with humor, the novel is absolutely laugh out loud funny, which just sounds weird, talking about
Right.
a Cormac McCarthy novel. But yeah, and so as I was going through it, and I remembered it being funny, and but also still with that same kind of dark gothic style. But as I was going through and looking at it, I realized that in this giant, because I think it is his easily his longest novel, in this giant just whale of a novel, he hides so many beautiful themes that definitely I didn't pick up on the first time through. But going back and rereading it and kind of skipping around from section to section, which I think is because sometimes I get lost in the story and I'm just turning pages and reading and not necessarily always processing every little bit. So sometimes I skip around to certain sections just to kind of focus on the craft or try to look at it a different way. But yeah, Suttree just kind of I already liked it, but it really knocked my socks off this second time through. And I think as again, like I said, it's not just as a writer that I want to kind of pick up and borrow on these things, but as a thinker too, right? Because we're all so impacted by our experiences, by what we see, by what we do, and certainly by what we read. And so I like going through and seeing if my perspective has changed since the last time that I read it. And if the same passages hit me the same way, better, worse, deeper, all that stuff. And so, yeah, I think rereading books is just like rewatching, your favorite movies or favorite TV shows. There's a certain comfort there, but also definitely kind of a litmus test of how you might have changed because the book hasn't changed, so it's just all how you interpret it.
Right. So I recently have been diving back into Steinbeck. So when I was a young man, I read all of the ones that he's mostly known for, like Of Mice and Men, Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden. And I enjoyed them as a young person, but they weren't necessarily my favorite. But what I'm discovering now is that I like him even more. I had just on a lark reread Of Mice and Men a couple months ago and found myself in tears at the end, and was talking to my wife about it. And there was something that kind of struck me was that just how great he is at setting a scene, right? And so when that book opens, the first two pages, they talk about the grassy area there near the water and just how detailed it is. He's good. He's great with dialogue. He's great with characterization. And that book is very short. It's only 105 pages, but he says a lot in those 105 pages. But then the other thing I realized from Steinbeck was that he has a bunch of comedic novels too that I'd never read before. And I remember, I don't know if you do, I get into an author, I go look up and read about him a little bit. And of course, there's like Tortilla Flat and Cannery Row, and I'd never read any of those. So I started reading Tortilla Flat, and it's hilarious. It's really
Yeah.
great. And it's not something that, just like you said with McCarthy, that I would imagine that Steinbeck would be writing comedies, but that was kind of more based on his real life because he was kind of one of those characters as a young man, kind of a drunkard, working
Mhm.
class person. He put himself in that position because he grew up kind of affluent. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, it's funny because that parallels Suttree almost identically, right? So Suttree is considered McCarthy's kind of semi-autobiographical novel, an affluent man who kind of chooses the slum life in Knoxville and is a drunkard and runs around, has all these shenanigans and wild times. But yeah, I think you see that a lot in authors, especially of that kind of time and place. It seems to be, that's kind of where we get some of the tropes about, drunk writers, and starving artists and all that stuff. But yeah, Steinbeck is somebody I go back to. I actually just reread Grapes of Wrath this year as well. I was working on the a forthcoming novel of mine that is set during the Great Depression, and so I think that's easily the best Great Depression fiction that there is Grapes of Wrath, and I was rereading that, and the third chapter in the Grapes of Wrath, which it doesn't mention any of the other characters, it doesn't move the plot. It is a chapter unto itself of the turtle crossing the road and just that allegory, which some people say that it's America, some people say it's humanity, some people say it's just the Joad family, whatever the turtle symbolizes. for you, but that third chapter of the turtle crossing the road and all the trials and tribulations that that it endures from one side to the other, man, that is, to me, that's one of, if not the best chapters in American literature, and man, it just had such an impact on me.
Right. So what's a new book you've read recently that you really knocked your socks off?
I just read Scott Blackburn's "It Dies with You," which I thought was really good. It's very much in kind of this. I don't know if it's a new trope or a new genre, but this kind of grit lit. You see the grit lit hashtag, and I'd never heard of that before, but I've heard it several times in the last couple of years. But I kind of the vanguard of that being like maybe David Joy and S.A. Cosby and some of these folks. And so I've been reading those novels a little bit just because I've heard people put me into that category. And so I figured I might want to find out a little bit about what that category is. But again, I read a little bit of stuff that my friends write. Like when May Cobb puts out a new book, I'll read her. So she had My Summer Darlings earlier this year, which was great. I mean, I feel like May is kind of in a league of her own right now when it comes to writing these salacious, like Desperate Housewives style, like, but dark, murder mystery things. Let's see. Kimberly Garza. Her book just came out, The Last of the Karankawas. That one was great. Probably the best book I think that I've read so far this year is Oleander City by Matt Bondurant. Matt Bondurant wrote The Wettest County in the World some years back, and that got turned into a movie called Lawless, and so that kind of shot him to literary fame. And but yeah, he came out with a book this year called Oleander City that's about the Great Hurricane in Galveston, and kind of the aftermath of that, and the Red Cross and the celebrity fundraising boxing match that was put on. And anyway, he's one of my favorite writers. I think he's one of the best that we have working right now, and I think he's in his prime. Honestly, I was really blown away by Oleander City. I thought it was just absolutely perfect blend of like strong lyrical prose, but knowing when to pull back and just let the plot run, and great, well-shaped characters. Yeah, I was jealous when I read that book. I got a little pissed. So that's how I knew I liked it, is it pissed me off a little bit because it was so well done.
Yeah, I read last month I read a book called Pictures of the Shark by Thomas McNeely. It's a book of short stories, but all the short stories have the same character, the same protagonist. And I was really struck by just how well he could write a sentence, just one of those writers where you just like, damn, he just, he packs a lot, and he has these type of sentences where he says a lot and he has a comma and he's like, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more, and just adds a little bit more.
Yep.
And it's just like, there's some confidence that you can see in that. And it when you see it. You don't see it very often, but when you see it, you're like, there's a lot of confidence in this writing, and I really appreciated that.
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right. Well, Beasts of the Earth, everybody go pick it up in October when it comes out. James Wade, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, appreciate you guys. And for those of y'all in Austin, we're going to be at Book People on October 12th with our friend of Austin Liti Limits, Owen Edgerton. So please pre-order through Book People, get some tickets to the event, and come on out, let's have fun.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liti Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.